The following words of Jesus were unique. No other gospel writer recorded them. Matthew wrote in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, he wrote these words, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Why were these words so memorable to Matthew that he alone recorded them? Well, for those who knew Matthew prior to his days as a follower of Jesus Christ, his life was a contradiction. Before becoming a follower of Jesus, he was known to some people as Levi. Levi was a priestly name. It wasn't the name of someone you would expect to find behind a tax collector's table. But there sat Levi, using the power of the Roman Empire to extort money from his Jewish kinsmen, inflating their tax bill and lining his pockets with the excess. As far as his countrymen were concerned, this put Levi on the same level as harlots, who were equally guilty of selling themselves to foreigners. No one can say for certain how Jesus came to know Levi. All anyone knows for sure is that one day, Jesus walked by Levi's booth and shocked everyone by calling him to become one of his 12 disciples. The tax collector didn't seem surprised, though. He immediately shut down his enterprise, vowing never to open it again, and then hosted a giant party to celebrate his turning from sin to follow Jesus. From then on, this former Roman collaborator would be known as Matthew, the gift of God. What was it about Jesus' words in Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30, that so impacted his life that only Matthew recorded them? Well, let's examine them closely this morning as we seek to be refreshed spiritually and mentally on this first Sunday in October, amid all the chaos and uncertainty of natural disasters, wars, gun violence, and economic challenges. The first thing that stands out to me is the great invitation that Jesus extends. "Come to me," are the words of Jesus. They must have sounded so refreshing to the ears of Matthew, the former tax collector. Generally, we all enjoy invitations. We love hearing words like, "Hey, come home for Christmas. Come on over for lunch. Come to the party. Come to the ball game. Hey, come, go shopping with me." Yeah, we love invitations. And Jesus extended his invitation to everyone. No one was excluded. Only those who excluded themselves by declining the invitation were left out. When Jesus invited everyone to come to him, he didn't invite them to become religious or join another religious organization per se. Jesus didn't come to earth to establish a new religion. He came to restore a broken spiritual relationship. He came to heal that brokenness and teach others how to love God and enjoy him forever. In other words, he came to teach us how to rest in him. Just before Jesus issued this great invitation, he declared there in verse 27 of that 11th chapter these words, "All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." So we cannot find peace with God the Father except through Jesus, his Son. Jesus, would later declare, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." That was a bold claim to make. Yet that is what Jesus said as he called everyone who was weary and burdened to come to him. When Matthew recorded this invitation to those who were weary and burdened, he used two very expressive Greek terms. The first word referred to weariness, as though one had been beaten. It was also the proper word used for physical tiredness induced by work or exertion or heat. This term is usually used to describe the severe exhaustion of a soldier in battle or a messenger who had run a long ways. Well, the second word is sort of like a shipping term, if you would. It means to load. It pictures a ship or an animal who's heavily burdened by a great weight. A frugal merchant, you see, would maximize his profits by using a limited number of pack animals so that each was laden with as much cargo as they could possibly bear. Jesus used this image to describe the hypocritical religious leaders who tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a little finger. And Jesus, I believe, would say, woe to those who profit from the misery of others. Jesus used these two words to describe what the religion of Judaism had become to the Jews of the first century there in Israel. They labored under man-made burden of religiosity. They endured an endless list of rules that governed virtually every aspect of life. All of these rules and regulations were based on laws handed down by God, but twisted and inflated to serve the desires of the religious elite to dominate the regular folks. Earnest Jews were spiritually demoralized and incapable of meeting further demands. They needed to find relief. In other words, they needed rest. 20 centuries later, we too are weary and burdened. We're often worried by the challenges of life. Life's hard. At times, life can become so harsh that we feel disappointed and discouraged. As the problems of life mount, we often feel weary. We feel exhausted. We may even feel beaten down by the challenges of life. Do you feel weary and burdened today? Do you feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders? Do you feel so tired that you maybe wonder if you can continue onward? If so, you're not alone. Jesus understands how you feel. And he came to invite you to come to him. When we come to him, what does Jesus promise us? Listen again to Jesus' words. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. When Jesus invites us to come to him, he offers us a great gift. It's the gift of rest. Yes, he offers rest to those who are weary and burdened. Do you need rest today? The word translated as rest comes from a Greek verb meaning to cause to stop or to put an end to something. It's closely akin to the Hebrew verb Shabbat, from which we derive the word Sabbath. You remember that for the Jews, every Friday evening at sundown, faithful Jews put an end to work, and until sunset the following day, they don't work. What religiosity had perverted, Jesus promised to restore. You know, religion often says stuff like this: work more, try harder, do this, don't do that, give until you have no more. God isn't yet pleased with you. Push, pull, harder, longer. Jesus looked to the hearts of exhausted, overburdened, anxious, stressed out people, and he offered a better way. So what is that better way? Jesus invited us to take up my yoke. He said, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. But what does that mean? Well, Jesus' metaphor there, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, has an obvious connotation to servitude that he clearly intended, but it really involves a bit more. A yoke, as you know, is a carved wooden beam that rests across the shoulders of a pair of oxen or mules, allowing them to pull a plow in tandem. In the Old Testament, a yoke was a symbol of burden or servitude. Jesus clearly intended to invoke this imagery with an ironic twist. Indeed, slavery to Christ is the greatest freedom a person can experience. However, the phrase, and learn from me, suggests that he intended more. You remember in the first century, Jewish rabbis used the phrase, take the yoke of, to mean become the pupil of such and such a rabbi. Well, unfortunately, the rabbis had become notoriously harsh and hypocritical. They added to the people's burdens and did not relieve them. Because of their misinterpretation and alteration of God's holy law, the yoke that Israel's teachers placed upon the shoulders of the people was that of a totally unwarranted legalism. It was a system of teaching that stressed salvation by means of strict obedience to a host of rules and regulations. Now here in Matthew 11:29, Jesus places his own teachings over against the teachings to which the people had become accustomed. Jesus' teaching does not increase our weariness or add unnecessary burdens to our lives. Jesus said something like this in today's terms. Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion? Well, come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you what it means and how to take a rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. You'll notice that Jesus described his yoke as excellent, serviceable, useful, adapted to its purpose, and good. Frequently, a carpenter would be commissioned to custom carve a yoke so perfectly that it would fit a particular animal. And with this type of yoke, an oxen or a donkey could pull a plow for many hours without chafing or blistering. So Jesus promised that his burden would be light and easy to bear. Jesus' yoke illustrates and conveys an invitation with three parts, really. He invites us to exchange our tiresome burden of legalism for a lifelong Sabbath of the soul. He invites us to accept him as our teacher so that we might learn how he coped, how he managed stress, how he faced the pressures of the world with tact and grace, how he forgave, how he ministered to others, and how he remained connected to the Father. He invites us to reject slavery to religiosity, wealth, status, relationships, and anything else that burdens us so that we might become a slave to him. The best word to describe servitude to Jesus is refreshment. When Jesus invited the weary and burdened to come to him, he offered them the gift of rest. He offered to refresh them. Rest came as they learned to take up his yoke and learn from him. In other words, enter into an obedient relationship with him. In the midst of all his bold claims, Jesus taught his followers something about himself. Did you notice how Jesus described himself in those verses? He described himself as gentle and humble of heart. So what did Jesus mean by those terms, gentle and humble of heart? Well, the first word generally means mild or friendly or pleasant. But readers of the Old Testament would know that the verb is to find oneself in a stunted, humble, lowly position. It was a social and economic term for one who is in the position of a servant. It describes the man who has no property and who has thus to earn his bread by serving others. Old Testament prophets later picked up the term to describe those who were obedient to God and who bore their exile from the promised land with quiet, hopeful trust in the Lord without a hint of anger. In other words, it describes a person who has absolutely no sense of entitlement. Isn't that unusual? How ironic. The one who was all-powerful freely chose to become humble and lowly for our sake. Contrast this with what Jesus said of the Pharisees in Matthew 23, starting with verse 5. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. The religious elite of the New Testament era was overbearing and burdensome, Jesus was gentle and humble of heart. The second word pictures someone bowing low and thus means bowed down, small and insignificant in comparison to something else. The Old Testament describes the posture of a righteous person before God. And to illustrate this, his high opinion of this lowly term, Jesus told this story in Luke 18 where he said, "The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get.' But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast. 'God, have mercy on me, a sinner.' I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Unlike the puffed up, self-important Pharisees, who had no genuine basis for pride and who deserved no exaltation for righteousness, Jesus deliberately identified himself with the people he came to lift up. To help the lowly, he became low. He burdened himself with the burdens of those he sought to free. And perhaps better than any other gospel writer, Matthew, the former tax collector, understood what it was like to be weighed down by the yoke of sin. As a hated tax collector, he knew what it was like to bear the burden of public disdain and disgrace and the yoke of private shame. He knew what it felt like to be considered undesirable. He knew what it felt like to be beaten down by others. Matthew also knew that only God's grace could relieve, refresh, and restore those who were weary and burdened. Grace has to be one of the loveliest words in the English language. It embodies almost every attractive quality we hope to find in others. Grace is a gift of the humble to the humiliated. Grace acknowledges the ugliness of sin by choosing to see beyond it. Grace accepts a person as someone worthy of kindness, despite whatever hard exterior keeps him or her separated from the rest of the world. Grace is a gift of tender mercy when it makes the least sense. In the Old Testament, the word for grace described God's unrelenting, overabundant love for people despite their unfaithfulness. Matthew, the former tax collector, he knew that Jesus had changed his life. This former tax collector, who was weary and burdened by the disease of sin, was healed by the grace of God and restored to a right relationship. Freed from slavery to sin, Matthew willingly accepted the call to follow Jesus and learned to rest in him. Jesus invites all of us to come to him. For those who are weary and burdened, Jesus invites us to join him and learn from him. Jesus promises to be gentle and humble in heart. When we take Jesus at his word and follow him, an amazing thing happens. We find rest. We find spiritual refreshment and restoration. Are you weary and burdened? Jesus says, "Come to me and rest in him." Because when Jesus mentions that invitation, it's not this. It's this. Will you pray with me?